The geographic area most closely associated with the emergence of a dependent agricultural system of subsistence in the Old World is the Fertile Crescent. From Egypt in the south in an arc along the Jordan Valley and into southeastern Turkey, then following the Tigris and Euphrates River towards the Persian Gulf. This is where we have the earliest archaeological evidence for a true dependence upon domesticated plants and animals in the world. Not talking about growing some spices or a small garden, but where large populations are entirely dependent upon an agricultural way of life. This is the first place that we have that evidence of that shift in the human relationship to the natural world. And this extends in this region all the way back to over 12,000 years, the very end of the last ice age. The populations in this region are referred to during this time period, the Epipaleolithic, the transition from the Ice Age to the Holocene, as Natufian. It's the archaeological name for them. We don't know what they called themselves, obviously, and it's an archaeological culture, not necessarily a language family, which means they're doing a lot of the same things, using a lot of the same material culture, but may represent more than one single ethnic group. They were hunting and gathering populations, and they took advantage of this narrow window of time that existed during the climate shift between the Ice Age and the Holocene, and were able to intensify their exploitation of these terrestrial resources, especially wild grasses and grazing animals. As a result, they developed new technologies like stone-bladed sickles that enhanced the efficiency of their harvest. They were still seasonally mobile, but these people were developing many of the skills and bodies of knowledge that would lead to the Neolithic Revolution. It's not just agriculture that happens, as we talked about before, but it's this transition to sedentism. And really, it's location, 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 right? We're talking about real estate. And increased investment in architecture leads to decreased mobility, which leads to a greater ability to store surplus, which leads to a cascade effect. Or is it the reverse? I mean, we know that these certain factors are connected, right? Is that if you're storing more, you can't move as much, so you don't move as much, so maybe you can store more. Is there a virtuous cycle here that one builds upon the other? Or was it that people had to stop moving and so they had to store more because they weren't able to exploit as wide a range? This is some of the really key questions, right? Where's the key catalytic effect here? On the left, you can see a map of some of the Natufian sites in the Levant there. The Natufian toolkits included many items from earlier Epipaleolithic traditions, including percussion blade technology, composite tools, highly refined bone working, and bifacial knives and points. They can really be seen as a transitional society, technologically, socially, and ecologically, in terms of the relationship of people to the natural world. You can see one of these stone-bladed sickles on the left there, and some finely crafted projectile points, and even a bone harpoon, indicating some use of aquatic resources. This is a map of a storage granary actually built somewhat inside a cave, a Hyonim cave in the Levant. And you can see here, between about 12,000 and 11,500 years ago, you have these distributions of the Natufian, or early pre-pottery Neolithic. They transition into one another, and some of the other archaeological cultures of the region at the time. The site of Dra in Jordan is one of the earliest pre-pottery Neolithic sites known at 11,500 years ago. And these are sites where people have transitioned to a large percentage of dependence upon agriculture. They're living fairly sedentary lives in terms of settlement mobility. They're probably working very hard, not sedentary in a personal sense, but in terms of whether they're moving their communities around the landscape. And yet, contrary to a lot of the expectations that people have, these people were not manufacturing fired clay ceramics. That's why it's referred to as the pre-pottery Neolithic. At Dra in Jordan, you have one of the earliest known granaries, and it has some of the first suggestion of a year-round occupation at a single site. Current research indicates that this site is right on the cusp between the transition between hunting and gathering and a dedicated agricultural way of life. And you can see this round structure here is what the archaeologists are excavating in this area right here, and that may be the oldest known granary or a storage structure for grain, harvested grain, that's been excavated anywhere in the world. Here you can see an artist's reconstruction of what that granary would have looked like. You can see these support beams and notch stones there at the bottom of the illustration, and the entryway that would have been used to keep the grain dry and free of vermin. And there was only one of these in the community, suggesting that this was a communally held granary rather than one where each individual household had their own. One of the other things that occurs really frequently, broadening our view just for a moment, in these Neolithic sites, this transition to agriculture, around the world, is we see groundstone axes. And they seem to be a marker, if you will, of the Neolithic revolution around the world. What they indicate technologically and in terms of human ecological relationships is the increased need or choice, depending on one's theory of human decision-making processes, right, to transform the environmental systems in and around human settlements. This represents a pattern of behavior that no longer operates with the natural system, such as with fire ecology and hunter-gatherers, but one that is radically and permanently, at least in terms of human lifespans, transformative. The axes are for clearing forests and shrublands to enable expansion of agricultural fields. They're also for obtaining building material, see that increased architectural investment, and firewood, increased energy needs, industrial production of things like plaster and later ceramics. So you can see a Hohokam axe here from Arizona, groundstone axes from Cahokia in Illinois, groundstone axes from the Capsian Neolithic in North Africa occurring in areas today where you no longer have very much in the terms of trees, let alone forests, and yet between about 10,000 and 7,000 years ago there was enough large shrubs like mesquite and whatnot, similar to the ones that you see in Arizona, that for these early farmers in North Africa, they needed to be able to clear this out. The area where you see the focus of this tends to be in areas like Tunisia and Morocco and the foothills of that area, which even today have more vegetation. It's not the open Sahara, but even the Sahara during this time period was a grassland. So these groundstone axes are not limited to one part of the world, but anywhere that people went and began needing to transform the environment and clear vegetation, because it's not just giant trees that you need to cut down if you are going to plant a field of crops. Even if it's a shrubland, you still need to clear the shrubs out in order to be able to do this. And so it's a very strong indicator. Even in Ireland, this is a beautiful jadeite axe from over 5,000 years ago from Ireland. You can see a Hawaiian woodworking adze there. All of these different places, all of these different peoples at different points in time, when they arrive in these new places, in the case of Hawaii, or when agriculture arrives, as in the case of Ireland, or when the economies are being transformed, as in the case of Arizona and Cahokia with maize agriculture coming in, or in the case of North Africa where the environment around you is changing. But whatever these changing factors, people make use of these tools, and so groundstone axes despite the fact that these different cultures and places are so widely separated from one another in terms of history and the crops that they're growing and all of that, it does seem to be a very consistent thing. Some of the earliest known groundstone axes are from Japan, and they date to about 30,000 years ago. There's strong evidence that these had been used both for felling trees and woodworking, most likely in the production of boats, since most of the Japanese archipelago was never attached to the mainland of Asia, even during the height of the last ice age. And the occupation of these islands would have required the use of seaworthy watercraft. So in this case, perhaps, the axes are less about the transforming of the forest into fields, but they are about a transformational thing, and they're about allowing people to cross these open water distances. And so they're transformative in that sense. They're transformative of human traveling ability, of human mobility through environments that humans otherwise couldn't survive. In that sense, it's like a space program, right? You're crossing these distances that people can't live in, open ocean. So these groundstone axes, wherever they occur, and whenever they occur, they're pretty incredible pieces of technology in terms of what they signal to us about what's going on in the lives and the world that these people are living in. And experimental replications done, some of them, almost a century ago by archaeologists in Denmark and other places in Europe, at replicating these groundstone axes and then seeing if they work. Here you can see a tree being chopped down with a groundstone axe. They do work, in fact. The way that they work and the cuts that they produce are different, but you can, in fact, cut down a tree quite easily with a groundstone axe if it's properly hafted and you know what you're doing. Then there's some other innovations that we see sometimes only once. This is the only known example archaeologically of the double-bladed stone sickle. You know how you get the razor blades for shaving that are, double-bladed or triple-bladed or quadruple-bladed? Well, maybe, apparently, not maybe, apparently at some point in the past, somebody thought, well, if one blade made out of sharp stone blade segments is good for cutting down the wheat, maybe if I put two parallel blades on this sickle, it'll be even better. And so they did it, and they made it, and it survived and was found by archaeologists. The interesting thing, it didn't catch on. This particular invention did not result in all kinds of double-bladed sickles being found in the archaeological record. So sometimes these innovations, people think about something, try something out, invent a new thing, and sometimes it takes off. And sometimes you see it like Clovis points, from Belize to Maine to Washington in under 300 years. And then sometimes you see the one example that you ever find, the double-bladed stone sickle. Because people aren't that different then than they are now. They have lots of ideas. Some good, some bad, and some apparently unnecessary. And one of the key things about the blade technology of the Neolithic is its interchangeable nature. You can take the segments of blades on the left here, made for those stone-bladed sickles. When you produce them on these cores, you manufacture those, and you can use them for the sickles. Or you can take that same piece of stone, and with a piece of antler, you basically use pressure to flake off small flakes around the bottom to put a tang on it so that you can use it as an arrow point. Or you can, use it as a blade. It's interchangeable technology. The basic point of it is that it's all kind of standardized. And that's a shift from earlier patterns of lithic manufacture. One of the key sites in the development of the pre-pottery Neolithic is the site of Ain Ghazal in Jordan, seen here on Google Earth. And it's a massive pre-pottery Neolithic site, actually within the city limits of Amman, Jordan. And on the right, you can see the different layers of occupation, different walls, different periods. This is what's referred to in the Near and Middle East as a tell, T-E-L-L. And that's a mounded archaeological site. And it's a mound, it's a hill, not necessarily because it was geologically a hill, but because so many layers and sequences of towns and cities and villages have been built on the same location that it's actually created this artificial hill. Here's an artist's reconstruction of what Ain Ghazal would have looked like at the time of its occupation, at the height of the pre-pottery Neolithic. It's a real town, right? This is not just 2 or 3 buildings. This is a real town. And many of the pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the Near and Middle East were very, very similar to this one. They also have these statues made out of plaster rather than ceramics, and they appear to be sort of these funerary associated vessels, or not vessels, figures. Sort of some of the earliest known figurative art after the sort of Venus figurines from the Paleolithic. One of the other interesting things that you see in pre-pottery Neolithic sites, including at Ain Ghazal, are these plastered skulls. And what you see here is this is an actual human skull with plastered facial features on it, and then shell and sometimes tar used to make the eyes. So this is a skull with a sort of permanent skin and flesh put back on it. And then these were placed in niches around the walls of the interior of the structures. And when they've done genetic studies of these, they actually come out as being related to the same people that are in the floors. And in many of the instances, several of the graves in the floors of these houses have had their skulls removed from them after burial. So you bury somebody, and then after quite a while, when it's all skeletal, you open the grave back up and you take the skull out and you place it up there in one of these niches. And it's really clear that what's going on here is not something macabre, but it is very much in line with, if you guys saw the film Coco, right? It's very much in line with the veneration of ancestors and an approach to the deceased, the dead, that's not a zombie horror movie kind of thing. It's about respect and remembrance of these people. And so for those of us in 21st century United States, this seems a bit macabre, but that would not have been the intent or the objective of doing this. It was more like having literally, the spirits of your ancestors watching over you and being there. Another thing that's really interesting about the pre-pottery Neolithic are the extensive trade networks. And you can see here networks that have been identified by tracking things like obsidian and ceramics and turquoise and marine shell, copper, whatnot, that's being moved around these different communities, some of which you saw on the map earlier. And you can see these really demonstrating that the Fertile Crescent really is a real thing, not just in terms of the rainfall or the places where agriculture can happen, but it was tied together through these different networks of trade and exchange. And you can see how they only get more extensive throughout the Neolithic. Here you can see some of the other sites. You have Ain Ghazal, and then to the southwest of Ain Ghazal you have the site of Jericho, which is an actual Neolithic site. In northern Iraq you have the site of Abu Huraira, and in southeastern Turkey the site of Çatal Höyük, one of the really famous sites dating to this time period. Here you can see on another map the location of Çatal Höyük there, north of the Taurus Mountains in what is today Turkey. Here's a shot of some of the actual excavations. You can see they've built this superstructure over to protect some of these mud brick structures, because once you excavate a mud brick structure from the archaeological deposits that surround it, it becomes vulnerable to rain and erosion, and so you have to be very cognizant of that and take appropriate measures to protect the archaeological remains from disintegration. This is an artist's reconstruction of Çatalhöyük. If you think about, and as we'll see later in this course, some of the Native American sites of the Southwest, where they referred to as the Pueblos, it's not entirely a dissimilar architectural pattern. And there's some strong similarities there, and that might make us consider, okay, if we're seeing these kinds of parallels in the architecture, what kinds of social parallels are there? Because the way in which you socially construct your space around you is a decision. You don't choose whether the ice age ends or not. You don't choose whether it rains more or rains less, but you do choose how you build your homes and how you lay your communities out and how you place them across the landscape. Why are these people all clustered together? Why don't they have houses, scattered around like, ranches in Wyoming? What's going on here that's parallel in the way these people are interacting with each other and the way the people in the Pueblo societies were interacting with each other? Some really interesting things to consider. And at Çatalhöyük, we also see some very early evidence for the construction of these shrines, these interior temple rooms that are intended for ritual, are intended as these places of the sacred, but they're not just kind of open air plazas, right? That's the artist's reconstruction, and then this is some of the actual archaeological evidence for these things. You can see the literal use of actual bullhorns as part of the architectural decoration is something that's really fascinating. And as we'll get to later when we talk about the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean, this is something that continued all the way up until the present day in some ways. Here you can see what has been interpreted as one of the earliest maps of a community, and that sort of enigmatic design on the back has actually been interpreted as a record of a volcanic eruption of one of the nearby volcanoes that has this twin peak with a saddle between it. And that would be a really interesting thing, because that volcano erupted during the occupation of Çatalhöyük, and so the residents would have been present to see this. And then to have it then represented here is pretty fascinating. The first artistic representation documenting a volcanic eruption. Here you can see some of the other rooms with vultures being represented. Really fascinating artistic style here. Another thing that's fascinating about Çatalhöyük is this notion of the goddess, because it is this female figure, however one wants to interpret it. This female figure is the most common anthropomorphic representation in art at the site. No comparable representation of males in the art, though the metaphor of the bull may serve that conceptual role. What is also interesting at Çatalhöyük is that this notion that their supernatural world was not one dominated by a single male deity, right, like we're used to in Western monotheistic Abrahamic traditions, but that we see relatively equal treatment of male and female burials. The burials of actual people at the site of Çatalhöyük, the men and the women, you don't really see much difference. There's not a higher status being accorded to the men than the women. And that might, support the notion that there was actually a female deity being represented here. There's less evidence overall, not just at Çatalhöyük. There's less evidence for gender-based structural inequality during the Neolithic than in later populations of the region. So the old idea that agriculture and sedentism and living in, houses and towns, was just, that's it. Once that happens, you have all of this structural inequality, does not appear to be the case, not even when it comes to gender relations. Because the Neolithic isn't just something that happens and immediately transitions into the Bronze Age. The Neolithic lasts for thousands of years. People lived like this for thousands of years in relative gender equality, with women and men being represented, or women being represented more frequently in art, at least at Çatalhöyük. It's an interesting kind of question. Maybe the whole notions that everybody talks about, how, oh, well, that's just the way it is and that's how men and women are, maybe that's the mythology, not the other way around. Maybe the creation of inequality is not a natural occurrence and is something that people actually have to try to do. They have to try to create and maintain systems of inequality. Because left to their own devices, it apparently is possible for people to live in relative equality, and it's an interesting question to consider. The genetic studies at Çatalhöyük on some of those remains I was talking about indicate wide social networks as well as high genetic diversity and varied maternal lineages. It does not appear that people are, marrying within the family, marrying within the community. Quite the opposite. They appear to be, you can see on the map here, deriving genetic material from all over the region, all the way into what is the Danube River Valley in southeastern Europe and the Grecian Peninsula, all the way up into the Caucasus Mountains and the Zagros over in what is today Iran, and south into the Levant and the Jordan River Valley. All of these different genetic lineages are found in the people at Çatalhöyük, which is another thing to really keep in mind in terms of how people represent the past. This notion of separated people and completely distinct populations, and this idea of some kind of, pure group of anybody. Well, apparently that wasn't the case 9,000 years ago, and it still isn't the case today. People, when they come into contact with one another, tend to do certain things. And one of the things that people do when they come into contact with one another, when populations come into contact with one another, is that there's gene flow between them. Remember, even between Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans. So why wouldn't that be the case between these early agricultural communities of the Neolithic? But as with everything, the Neolithic of the Near East does fall apart. It falls apart largely because of continued climatic shifts and the inability of the landscape following those climatic shifts to continue to support such large, dense agricultural populations. What we see as the landscape gets drier, as precipitation drops, as the deserts expand, as the amount of the landscape that can be farmed decreases, is that we see the collapse of these large settlements and a decrease in their number. And these large settlements collapse. Some portions of their populations continue to be sedentary farmers, but they tend to retreat into smaller, the very best spots, refugia, where they can continue to farm because the soil and precipitation is enough for that to continue. The rest of the populations cease being entirely sedentary and begin to adopt an entirely new way of life that didn't exist during hunting and gathering times, didn't exist during much of the pre-pottery Neolithic, and that's mobile pastoralism. People who have herds of sheep and goats, and later cattle, camels, donkeys, whatnot, depending upon the region that you're in, horses in Mongolia, right? But they have herds of animals, and they depend upon these herds of animals. But these herds of animals can be moved around from place to place, often over huge distances between grazing areas and watering holes and whatnot, and they're not dependent anymore upon that one good spot like they were in the Neolithic, because they were trying to do farming and grazing these herds of animals in the same spot, and that's another thing that contributed to the collapse of the pre-pottery Neolithic. Well, these people try this new way of life, and they become adept at this. And you have what's referred to as the secondary products revolution, where it's not just about the meat from these animals, or their skins, or their bones. It's about the wool that can be produced, and then woven into textiles. You can see on the left a Bedouin loom at use, making a long single piece of cloth. Anybody know what the photograph on the right is? I'll tell you. The photograph on the right is actually a goatskin bag for making yogurt. You put the milk in there and you shake it up. You keep it from settling completely every so often. You keep it in the shade, and that is one of the ways that you have some of the first processed dairy products. Milk cannot be stored for very long, especially in high temperature environments. But you can use it to produce yogurt and cheese and butter and all kinds of other things that can be stored for much longer periods of time, and then can be traded along with your textiles that you're making here to the few populations that are still in these more isolated and smaller farming communities where you can get grain. And so these people that had once been one people split apart, and some of them become farmers and some of them become pastoralists, but they always maintain interaction with one another because the pastoralists can produce things that the farmers can't, and the farmers can grow and store surplus crops that the pastoralists can't. And so while they're living apart and living very different lives and practicing very different economies, they're not actually completely separate from one another. And the descendants, the direct descendants of those people that at the collapse of these pre-pottery Neolithic towns like Ain Ghazal and Chatal Hoyuk, the people who tried out a new way of life, this mobile pastoralism, their direct descendants are the Bedouin of today. People you can find across the Middle East and Near East and even into North Africa, a remarkably resilient and adaptive people who deserve a whole class unto themselves. I won't attempt to do them justice in one slide. But that they are the direct descendants of these pioneering folks who survived the collapse of the pre-pottery Neolithic is one of the things I want you to remember. So they represent one of the people who we can actually trace back the origins of an ethnic group further than just about anywhere else in the world. Last thing I want to talk about here is the Black Sea flood. This happened about 9,300 years ago and was catastrophic for villages throughout the region. Because during this time period of the Neolithic, you have large villages, right, all around the shores of the Black Sea. It's great farmland. And when the flood happens, it results in this large-scale population movement of farmers, including some of the earliest farming communities to move into Europe. You can see here on the left, this is a cross-section through the Bosporus, from the Dardanelles and the Bosporus to the Black Sea. At the time, it was a freshwater lake. And the sea level before about 9,400 years ago was still low enough that the Bosporus sill there between Turkey and northeastern Greece, Bulgaria, that's kept the waters of the Mediterranean from spilling into this giant freshwater lake. As sea level rises, you actually see the movement of the sea over the Bosporus sill and the rapid flooding of the Black Sea basin with salt water. And we see the dead layers of freshwater mollusks and everything. There's a reason why the Black Sea has an anoxic, an oxygenless layer at its bottom, is because of this actual geological event. It would have created really epic floods, and it would have totally ruined all of the farmland immediately around it. You go from a freshwater lakeshore to a seawater beach, and that's going to have dramatic impacts. And populations moved rapidly after this massive flood. The amount of seawater flowing over there on an hourly rate was dozens of square kilometers. The sound of the flood coming through the Bosporus you would have been able to hear it from over 400 miles away. This was something that happened, and this was something that people would have experienced, and it would have been a massive story. And so you can see these diasporas, migrations, and new homelands. from the Black Sea down into the Near East, from the Black Sea into the Balkans, from the Black Sea up into the Danube River and into Western Europe. And all of these other groups can likely trace some aspect of their origins to this massive event. And is it any surprise that all of these populations throughout this area also have a story about a massive flood? Last thing I want to show you before we move on to later time periods. This is what's known as a Danish dagger. It's made in flint, but it's actually made to mimic a bronze dagger with a stitched leather handle. Because, and the reason why I want to show you this is that these transitions that we're talking about, we tend to think of them as these instantaneous things, right? You level up, you achieve enough points, and now you're in the Bronze Age. But actually, these things occur within very real economic and social contexts. And this was being made, these artifacts like this one were being made in Denmark after the development of bronze working in the Near and Middle East, but before the technology of bronze working had made its way into Northern Europe. And yet people wanted to have these high prestige artifacts. And if you couldn't have an actual imported bronze dagger, you had one that mimicked all of the structural elements down to the stitching on the leather handle. You can see where they've done that. And that's very difficult work to do in flint. But because they're trying to imitate this other form as an object of prestige and art, they made this effort. And so think about that when you think about these transitions. Think about it not as leveling up in a video game, but as something that's happening not evenly across the landscape and not in a linear fashion. The Neolithic happened, but as we'll see soon, the Bronze Age didn't happen right away. It wasn't a smooth linear progression. The Neolithic fell apart. Populations collapsed. You did not see towns of the size of Çatalhöyük and Ain Ghazal for many centuries. Nearly a millennia goes by before you have population centers of that size again. So there really was this complete reversal in the trends of populations. Those towns never grew into cities, not linearly. Sometimes they happen. Amman, Jordan, like I said, is in the same spot, but it's not a linear growth. Ain Ghazal was a ruin before Amman was ever founded. And so it's not even in terms of time. It's not even in terms of space. And a lot of our expectations about what is natural or what is the way things are, the way things were, as we learn more and more from archaeology, it becomes less and less clear that a lot of those things that we've been taught, that men do the hunting and women do the gathering. Well, recent discoveries in places like Peru and elsewhere are showing that no, apparently women did quite a bit of hunting, right? So you shouldn't exclude them just because your, personal education as a person, your personal upbringing said that. It may not actually be that way through time and space and for all people. And so we have to begin to examine our assumptions and not assume that everything has this even baseline to it. And it makes it a lot more fun to try to investigate these things because you can't take very many things for granted anymore.